In the autumn of 1884, something impossible was happening in the farmlands of eastern Iowa. Entire cornfields, ready for harvest and worth hundreds of dollars, would stand golden and full at sunset, only to be found completely barren by dawn. Not a single stalk remaining, not even broken stems or scattered kernels to suggest how thousands of pounds of corn could vanish without a trace. The Briarwood farm phenomenon defied every law of agriculture and human capability, leaving investigators baffled and the local community gripped by fear and suspicion. Before we delve into the dark secrets that plagued Thomas Briar and his seemingly cursed land, take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about small-town America. And let us know in the comments what city and country you're listening from. We love connecting with our global audience who shares our fascination with history's darkest mysteries. But what we're about to uncover goes far beyond simple agricultural anomalies, revealing a web of deception that would shake the very foundations of rural Iowa society. Among the fragmented records kept by the Polk County Sheriff's Department and the whispered accounts passed down through generations of Iowa farmers, the story of Briarwood Farm emerges as one of the most disturbing cases of organized crime in the American Midwest's agricultural history. The year 1884 found Iowa in the midst of an agricultural boom that had transformed the prairie landscape into a patchwork of prosperous farms. The completion of railroad lines had connected even remote farming communities to eastern markets, and European immigrants were flooding into the state, drawn by promises of fertile land and honest work. In Madison County, just southeast of Des Moines, small farming communities dotted the rolling hills where corn and wheat grew tall in the rich black soil. It was in this setting that Thomas Briar had established his farm 5 years earlier, purchasing 320 acres of prime farmland along Turkey Creek. The Briarwood Farm, as locals had begun calling it, sat at the intersection of 3 rural townships, making it a natural gathering point for the immigrant workers who moved between farms during planting and harvest seasons. Briar, a tall, lean man in his early 40s with graying temples and calloused hands, had quickly earned a reputation as one of the more prosperous farmers in the area. Unlike many of his neighbors who struggled with the unpredictable weather and fluctuating crop prices, Briar seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to maintain his prosperity year after year. His farmhouse, a 2-story white clapboard structure with green shutters, stood in stark contrast to the modest dwellings of his neighbors. The barn, painted bright red with white trim, was larger than most others in the county, and Briar's fences were always in perfect repair. What made Briar particularly notable in the community was his role as an unofficial employment coordinator for immigrant workers. Germans, Norwegians, and Irish immigrants would often stop at Briarwood Farm first when seeking work, and Briar would direct them to other farms in the area. He spoke broken German and enough Norwegian to communicate with the newcomers, and his wife, Martha, often provided meals for the weary travelers who had walked miles between farms looking for employment. The local community of Winterset, the nearest town with a population of just over 2,000, viewed Briar as a pillar of the agricultural community. He attended the Methodist Church every Sunday, served on the Township Road Committee, and was known to extend credit to neighbors during difficult times. His corn yields consistently exceeded those of surrounding farms, and his livestock appeared healthier and more numerous each year. Martha Briar, a quiet woman in her late 30s with prematurely gray hair, always pulled back in a tight bun, managed the household with Germanic efficiency. She had immigrated from Bavaria with her first husband, who had died of consumption during their second winter in Iowa. Her marriage to Thomas in 1881 had been viewed as a practical arrangement that benefited both parties. She gained security and citizenship, while he acquired a competent housekeeper and someone who could communicate with the growing German immigrant population. The rhythm of life at Briarwood Farm followed the predictable patterns of Midwest agriculture. Spring brought the careful preparation of fields and the planting of corn, oats, and hay. Summer meant long days of cultivation and maintenance, watching for signs of disease or pest damage that could destroy a year's work. But it was autumn that truly defined the success or failure of a farming operation, when the harvest would determine whether a family would prosper or struggle through the coming winter. The first incident occurred on the night of September 23rd, 1884, during what should have been the peak of harvest season. Briar's 40-acre cornfield along the eastern boundary of his property had been ready for harvest for nearly a week. The corn stood 8 feet tall, the ears heavy and golden, representing potentially $600 in income, more than many families earned in an entire year. That evening, Briar had walked the field's perimeter with his hired hand, a young Norwegian immigrant named Erik Larsen, discussing plans to begin cutting the following morning. The crop was perfect, with no signs of disease or pest damage. Larsen would later tell investigators that he had never seen corn of such uniform quality and abundance. Martha Briar prepared an early supper that night, knowing that harvest would mean dawn to dusk work for the next several days. She remembered hearing her husband and Larsen discussing which sections to cut first and how many additional workers they would need to bring in to complete the harvest efficiently. The conversation was mundane, focused on practical concerns that had occupied farmers for generations. But when Erik Larsen arrived at the farm before sunrise the next morning, ready to begin the day's work, he found Thomas Briar standing at the edge of what had been the cornfield, staring at 40 acres of completely bare ground. Not a single cornstalk remained. The soil appeared freshly disturbed, as if it had been recently ploughed, but there were no furrows or patterns that would indicate the use of farming equipment. Larsen would later describe the scene to the county sheriff as impossible and terrifying. He had expected to spend the day cutting corn, but instead found himself staring at empty fields under the grey dawn sky. There were no tire tracks from wagons, no hoof prints from the dozens of horses that would have been required to remove such a massive amount of grain, and no scattered kernels or broken stalks that would normally be left behind even by the most careful harvesting operation. Thomas Briar's reaction was equally puzzling. Rather than displaying the anger or devastation that would be expected from a farmer who had just lost hundreds of dollars in crops, he appeared more confused than distraught. He walked the perimeter of the empty field methodically, occasionally kneeling to examine the soil, but his demeanor suggested bewilderment rather than the rage that should have consumed a man facing financial ruin. Martha Briar, when she learned of the disappearance, simply nodded and returned to her kitchen work without comment. Larsen found her lack of emotional response as disturbing as the missing corn itself. In a community where crop failure could mean starvation, the loss of an entire field should have been a catastrophe that brought neighbors running with offers of help and sympathy. By mid-morning, word of the mysterious disappearance had spread throughout the township. Neighbors arrived on horseback and in wagons, drawn by curiosity and concern. They walked the empty field, examining the soil and searching for any clue that might explain what had happened. The ground showed signs of recent activity, but the patterns were unlike anything produced by conventional farming equipment. Old Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant who had been farming in Iowa since before the Civil War, declared that in 40 years of agriculture, he had never seen anything like it. "Corn doesn't just disappear," he told the growing crowd of onlookers. "Even if thieves took it, they would leave tracks, broken stalks, something. This is like the earth just swallowed it whole." The local Methodist minister, Reverend William Crawford, arrived that afternoon and offered prayers for the Briar family's recovery from this mysterious loss. But even he seemed more puzzled than sympathetic, noting privately to his wife that Thomas Briar's acceptance of the situation seemed almost resignation rather than shock. The weeks following the first incident transformed the Briarwood farm from a symbol of agricultural success into a source of community unease and speculation. Thomas Briar filed a claim with the Prairie States Insurance Company, a firm that had recently begun offering crop insurance to Iowa farmers. The claim, for $650, represented one of the largest ever filed in Madison County. The insurance company's investigator, a methodical man named James Morrison, who traveled throughout the Midwest examining suspicious claims, arrived in Winterset 3 weeks after the incident. Morrison had investigated dozens of crop losses due to drought, hail, fire, and theft, but he had never encountered a case where an entire field of mature corn had simply vanished without a trace. Morrison's investigation revealed several troubling inconsistencies. The soil analysis showed evidence of recent disturbance, but the patterns were inconsistent with any known harvesting technique. More disturbing was the discovery that the field's yield estimates, based on early season growth patterns, had been significantly higher than typical for the region. Either Briar was an exceptionally skilled farmer, or there were factors influencing his crop production that weren't immediately apparent. During his interviews with neighbors, Morrison began to notice a pattern of odd occurrences surrounding the Briarwood farm that residents had previously dismissed as coincidental. Several farmers mentioned that they had seen unusual nighttime activity in the area, lantern lights moving across fields long after normal working hours, and the sounds of heavy wagons traveling the rural roads during the early morning hours when most farmers were still asleep. Eric Larson provided Morrison with additional details that hadn't emerged during the initial investigation. He had worked for Briar for 6 months, and during that time he had noticed that his employer often sent him on lengthy errands to town or to neighboring farms, sometimes for days at a time. During these absences, Briar would often complete significant amounts of farm work alone, which seemed impossible for a single person to accomplish. More puzzling was Larson's observation that the farm's immigrant workers seemed to change frequently. He had expected to work alongside the same crew throughout the growing season, but instead found that workers would disappear after a few weeks, supposedly moving on to other opportunities. Briar always had explanations. The workers had found better-paying jobs, or had decided to return to their families, or had simply moved on without notice, as immigrant laborers often did. Martha Briar's behavior also raised questions during Morrison's investigation. When asked about the missing corn, she provided answers that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. She claimed to have been asleep during the night when the corn disappeared and had heard nothing unusual. But several neighbors mentioned that lights had been visible in the Briar farmhouse well past midnight, and that Martha was often seen doing laundry at odd hours, sometimes hanging clothes to dry before dawn. The insurance company ultimately denied Briar's claim, citing insufficient evidence of theft and the impossibility of the claimed scenario. But this decision only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. If the corn hadn't been stolen, where had it gone? And if Briar was attempting insurance fraud, how had he managed to dispose of such a massive amount of grain without leaving any trace? The denial of the insurance claim should have been financially devastating for the Briar family, but Thomas seemed to accept the decision with the same odd resignation he had shown when the corn first disappeared. Rather than appealing the decision or seeking legal recourse, he simply continued with his farming operations as if nothing had happened. The second incident occurred 6 weeks later, on November 8, 1884, and this time it involved more than just Thomas Briar's property. 3 neighboring farms reported similar disappearances on the same night, entire fields of corn and oats vanishing without explanation, leaving behind only disturbed soil and bewildered farmers. Heinrich Müller lost 20 acres of prime corn, representing his family's primary source of income for the year. The Peterson farm, owned by Norwegian immigrants who had been in Iowa for only 2 years, lost their entire oat crop, which they had planned to use both for livestock feed and as seed for the following year's planting. Most disturbing was the case of the O'Sullivan farm, where not only did the crops disappear, but 3 of their immigrant workers who had been sleeping in the barn also vanished without a trace. The pattern of disappearances was too coordinated to be coincidental, yet too impossible to be the work of conventional thieves. County Sheriff Daniel Hayes found himself facing the most perplexing case of his career. A veteran of both local law enforcement and the Civil War, Hayes had dealt with cattle rustlers, crop thieves, and various forms of rural crime, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the logistics of stealing thousands of pounds of grain from multiple locations simultaneously without leaving tracks or witnesses. Hayes's investigation revealed that all 4 affected farms employed significant numbers of immigrant workers, primarily Germans, Norwegians, and Irish, who moved between properties seeking seasonal employment. More importantly, all of the farms had connections to Thomas Briar, who had served as an unofficial employment coordinator, directing workers to properties throughout the county. The sheriff's most disturbing discovery came when he attempted to track down some of the missing immigrant workers for questioning. County records showed that dozens of immigrants who had been documented as working in the area during the summer months could not be located. Some had supposedly moved on to other states. Others had allegedly returned to their home countries, but the number of disappearances seemed unusually high for a region that typically retained its immigrant population from season to season. Dr. Samuel Whitmore, the county coroner, provided Hayes with additional information that deepened the mystery. During the past 2 years, he had been called to examine the bodies of several immigrant workers who had allegedly died from accidents or illness while working on various farms. While the deaths appeared natural on the surface, Whitmore had noticed patterns that troubled him. All of the deceased had been healthy young men, and all had died during periods when they were supposedly working alone or in remote locations. The doctor's record showed that in most cases the bodies had been discovered by Thomas Briar or one of his associates, and that Briar had often volunteered his property for burial when the deceased had no known family in the area. The immigrant cemetery on the Briarwood farm had grown to include nearly 30 graves over the past 2 years, an unusually high number for a single farming community. Hayes decided to conduct a more thorough investigation of the Briarwood property, but his initial requests to search the premises were met with polite cooperation from Thomas Briar that somehow yielded very little useful information. Briar provided access to his barns and outbuildings, but always seemed to anticipate the areas Hayes wanted to examine, having already cleaned or reorganized spaces before the sheriff's arrival. The investigation took a significant turn when Hayes received an unexpected visitor at his office in Winterset. Anna Kowalski, a young Polish woman who worked as a domestic servant for a family in Des Moines, had traveled to Madison County specifically to inquire about her brother Stanisław, who had been working on area farms during the summer months. Anna had received several letters from her brother throughout the summer, describing his work on various farms and his plans to save money to bring their parents to America. The last letter, dated August 15th, had mentioned that he was working for a farmer named Briar and that the work was more demanding than expected, but that the pay was good. Since then, she had heard nothing, despite Stanisław's promise to write weekly. Hayes's investigation into Stanisław Kowalski's disappearance revealed a troubling pattern. According to Thomas Briar, the young Polish immigrant had worked at Briarwood Farm for only 2 weeks before deciding to move on to opportunities in Nebraska. But Anna's inquiries with railroad agents and other immigrants in the area produced no evidence that her brother had ever left Madison County. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Dr. Benjamin Foster, a geology professor from the State University of Iowa who had been conducting soil surveys in Madison County as part of a statewide agricultural study, made a discovery that would transform the investigation from a case of mysterious crop theft into something far more sinister. Foster had been examining soil composition and drainage patterns throughout the county when he requested permission to conduct test borings on several properties, including the Briarwood farm. His initial focus was purely scientific. He was studying how different soil types affected crop yields and investigating the underground water systems that made Iowa farmland so productive. But when Foster began his soil analysis on the Briarwood property, his equipment produced readings that defied explanation. The areas where crops had allegedly disappeared showed soil composition patterns that were completely inconsistent with normal agricultural land. Instead of the expected layers of topsoil and subsoil, his test borings revealed sections where the earth had been extensively disturbed and refilled, creating a patchwork of different soil types that shouldn't exist naturally. More disturbing was Foster's discovery of organic material in the soil samples that appeared to be decomposing matter, but not the type of plant material that would result from normal farming operations. Chemical analysis suggested the presence of bone fragments and other materials that had no place in agricultural soil. When Foster shared his findings with Sheriff Hayes, both men realized they were no longer investigating crop theft, but potentially something far more serious. Hayes obtained a court order to conduct a thorough excavation of the Briarwood property, focusing on the areas where Foster's equipment had detected the most significant soil disturbances. The excavation began on December 3, 1884, during the first hard freeze of winter. Hayes had assembled a team that included the county coroner, Dr. Foster, and several trusted deputies, along with equipment borrowed from a local mining operation. They started with the field where the first corn crop had disappeared, working systematically to uncover whatever lay beneath the disturbed soil. What they found would haunt the residents of Madison County for generations to come. Just 3 feet below the surface, in soil that should have contained only the root systems of harvested corn, the excavation team uncovered the first of what would eventually be identified as more than 40 human graves. The bodies were those of young men, all apparently healthy adults, who had died under circumstances that were clearly not natural. Dr. Whitmore's preliminary examination revealed evidence of violence, fractured skulls, broken bones, and signs of physical trauma that were inconsistent with accidental death or illness. The victims had been buried hastily, often without coffins or proper preparation, simply wrapped in canvas or old blankets and covered with soil. As the excavation continued, a horrifying pattern emerged. The graves were organized in rough rows, like a crop field, and the soil disturbance patterns matched exactly with the areas where crops had mysteriously disappeared. The harvest that had vanished overnight hadn't been corn at all, but evidence of systematic murder that had been carefully concealed beneath a facade of agricultural prosperity. Thomas Briar was arrested on December 5, 1884, but his initial response to the charges was the same odd resignation he had shown throughout the investigation. He neither denied the accusations nor provided explanations for the discoveries on his property. Instead, he simply stated that the sheriff would need to speak with his business partners to understand the full scope of the operation. This cryptic comment led to the most shocking revelation of the entire investigation. The Briarwood farm murders were not the work of a single disturbed individual, but part of an organized conspiracy involving multiple farmers throughout Madison County and beyond. The complete truth about the Briarwood farm operation emerged during the winter of 1884-1885, as Sheriff Hayes and county prosecutors methodically unraveled a conspiracy that had been operating for nearly 3 years. Thomas Briar, faced with overwhelming physical evidence and the testimony of surviving witnesses, eventually provided a full confession that revealed the systematic nature of the crimes. The operation had begun in 1882, during a period when Iowa farmers were struggling with unpredictable weather and falling crop prices, while simultaneously facing an influx of immigrant workers who were willing to work for wages that established farmers couldn't afford to pay their regular employees. Briar had initially partnered with 4 other farmers in the area to develop what they called a labor management system that would allow them to utilize immigrant workers more efficiently. The system worked by recruiting immigrants who had no established connections in the community, recent arrivals who spoke little English and had no family or friends in the area, to inquire about their whereabouts if they disappeared. These workers would be promised steady employment and good wages, and were often housed in remote barns or outbuildings where they had little contact with the general community. Initially, the conspiracy had focused on labor exploitation, working the immigrants for extended hours, providing minimal food and shelter, and paying them far less than promised. But the operation had gradually evolved into something far more sinister, when the conspirators realized that these isolated workers could be eliminated entirely without anyone noticing their absence. The murders were motivated by simple greed. Dead workers required no wages, no food, and no shelter, but their labor could still be claimed for insurance and government benefit purposes. The conspirators would report normal employment levels to agricultural agencies while actually operating with significantly reduced labor costs. They also discovered that immigrant workers often carried their entire life savings in cash, providing an immediate financial incentive for murder. The crop insurance fraud was a secondary scheme designed to provide additional income while concealing the evidence of the murders. By claiming that entire fields had been stolen, the farmers could collect insurance payments while actually having harvested the crops, using the unpaid labor of victims who were subsequently killed and buried in the same fields. Thomas Briar's role in the conspiracy was as the coordinator and disposal specialist. His farm's location at the intersection of 3 townships made it an ideal location for the clandestine cemetery, and his reputation as an employment coordinator gave him access to the steady stream of potential victims. Martha Briar, investigators learned, had been a reluctant participant who helped identify which workers would be least likely to be missed. The nighttime harvesting that neighbors had occasionally witnessed was actually the process of burying bodies and rearranging the soil to conceal the graves. The conspirators would work quickly during the hours before dawn, using the legitimate agricultural activity as cover for their disposal operations. The crops that allegedly disappeared overnight had actually been harvested weeks earlier, with the fields maintained in a deceptive state of readiness until the burial operations required the soil to be disturbed. Erik Larsen, the Norwegian farmhand, had been kept ignorant of the true nature of the operation through careful scheduling that ensured he was never present during the actual murders or burial activities. His legitimate witness testimony about the impossible crop disappearances had actually provided perfect cover for the conspiracy, making the crimes appear supernatural rather than criminal. The investigation ultimately revealed that the conspiracy had extended beyond Madison County, with similar operations discovered in 3 other Iowa counties, and evidence suggesting connections to comparable schemes in Nebraska and Minnesota. The total number of victims was estimated at more than 200 immigrant workers who had been murdered across the Midwest between 1882 and 1884. The trials of Thomas Briar and his co-conspirators began in March 1885 and continued throughout the summer. The case attracted national attention, with newspaper reporters from Chicago, St. Louis, and New York traveling to Winterset to cover what was being called the most extensive murder conspiracy in American agricultural history. Briar was ultimately convicted of 37 counts of murder and sentenced to death, though he would die in prison of pneumonia before the sentence could be carried out. His co-conspirators received sentences ranging from life imprisonment to death, depending on their level of involvement in the actual murders. Martha Briar, who testified against her husband in exchange for clemency, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The Briarwood farm property was seized by the county and eventually sold at auction, but the buyer was never able to make the land productive. Local superstition held that the soil had been poisoned by the blood of the innocent, though the actual reason was probably the extensive soil disturbance caused by the excavations and the psychological reluctance of workers to labor on land associated with such horrors. The immigrant community in Iowa was devastated by the revelations, not only because of the loss of life, but because the murders had been motivated by the same prejudices and economic pressures that made immigrant workers vulnerable in the first place. The case led to significant changes in how Iowa regulated agricultural labor and monitored the treatment of immigrant workers. Dr. Foster's soil analysis techniques, developed during the investigation, became a standard tool for law enforcement agencies investigating suspected burial sites. His methods were eventually adopted by police departments throughout the Midwest and contributed to the solution of several other cases involving concealed graves. The case also led to major reforms in crop insurance policies, with companies implementing more rigorous investigation procedures and requiring physical verification of claimed losses. The Prairie States Insurance Company, which had initially denied Briar's claim, used the case as an example of how careful investigation could prevent fraudulent payouts. Erik Larsen, the Norwegian farmhand whose testimony had been crucial to the investigation, eventually established his own farm in western Iowa. He became an advocate for immigrant workers' rights and helped establish cooperative employment agencies that provided safer working conditions and better protection against exploitation. The final official count identified 43 bodies buried on the Briarwood farm property, representing immigrants from 7 different countries who had come to America seeking opportunity and prosperity. A memorial monument was erected in the Winterset Cemetery in 1887, bearing the names of the identified victims and a simple inscription. They came seeking the American dream and found only American greed. The Briarwood farm case stands as a reminder that the prosperity of American agriculture was built not only on fertile soil and favorable weather, but on the labor and sacrifice of countless immigrants who contributed to the nation's growth, sometimes at the ultimate cost. The mystery of the missing harvests was solved, but the deeper questions about exploitation, prejudice, and the price of prosperity continued to haunt Iowa's agricultural communities for decades to come. This case reminds us that beneath the surface of pastoral tranquility can lie the darkest chapters of human cruelty and greed. What started as an impossible agricultural mystery revealed the systematic murder of dozens of innocent people whose only crime was seeking a better life. If this story has moved you to think about the hidden histories in your own community, share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of remembering these forgotten victims. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that illuminate the darker corners of American history, and let us know in the comments how this case makes you reflect on the true cost of prosperity in your own region. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying mysteries are often the ones rooted in human nature itself.